All right, hello. Today we're going to be talking about the initial visual examination of a vessel. Today when we're doing this, we're going to have a little bit of basic PPE. First off, hard hat, you want that on the pier. You're going to want your 4-gas meter with you, clipped on and ready to go. Want it bump checked or calibrated properly. I typically like to have a flashlight just in case the pier is a little dark. And standard gloves, steel toe boots, coveralls. So what we're going to look at when we're out on the vessel right off the bat is basically the overall condition of the vessel for damage, corrosion, even signs that something has gone wrong with the vessel during transit or when berthing. So you can see on this vessel, you've got some signs of wear on the paint. That's not necessarily a bad thing. It might be an indicator, but we see this all the time. They go through the canals, they bump up with tugs, they rub against the piers. So it's just a little bit of signage that's been used. It's wear and tear. But what we're really concerned about is seeing signs of pit corrosion that's excessive. We like to look for signs of insets that are really sharp, especially with tugs, piers. If you come over here and you look at the contact point, you can see where the vessel is making contact with the pier. That surface area is a lot smaller compared to the entire surface area of the vessel. So when she's been pressed up against the pier, that's a potential contact point where you see insets. This one looks really good, so it's nice, it's even, it's flush. But on other vessels, you might see some ribbing or insets just from that, those contact points with the pier, tugs, and sometimes other vessels. Over here, you can kind of see some bubble corrosion forming, and that's also okay for these vessels. You just want to see if it's excessive, and anything anything that seems a little out of the usual for your experiences, just talk to the captain. See what their history of the vessel is. Ask them when their next dry dock is. See if they're going to be going in and taking care of some of these things. And if it's really bad, if you're seeing something that shows absolute signs of damage, it's a good chance to ask them about conditions of class. Those are opportunities where they communicate with their classification society and they're saying, we had damage sustained and we have a plan to take care of it in the future. Now, also while you're out here, you can take a look at the mooring arrangements, and there's just a couple things to look at there. Over here is the forward lead line, and so that's their number 1 line. A lot of these vessels will normally have between 4 and 8 lines, but these are basically what's keeping them fast to the pier. So you can imagine that's pretty important. If those aren't set properly and we're about to walk on this ship, it could put us at risk and others at risk. So just by doing a quick check, seeing if they've got a good tautness to them, if they're nice and straight, with only a little bit of, we call it catenary, a little bit of a sag, which is acceptable. And we're also seeing how they're made off. It gives us a sense of safety for when we're on board the vessel. So you follow the line down, you'll see the bit on the pier. For these big deep draft vessels, those bits are huge. Their whole purpose is to keep that vessel parked. So just like the lines, we want to take a look at them, see if they're starting to wobble, if they're loose. And 99% of the time they're fine, but we always want to keep them in our mind, our purview, for potential safety concerns while we're on the vessel. There's a couple other things that we could look at for the mooring lines. On all of our reports, they're typically going to require to have rat guards. You can't really see it really well, but it's dangling there off of this vessel. So the rat guard at this point has probably been blown off by the wind or the surging of the vessel. This is a great opportunity for us to have a talk with the captain, say, hey, we saw your rat guards were a little loose, they're coming off the lines. We'd recommend you go back and make sure they're put on the line properly. And that's really for their protection, because it's protecting vermin, rats, from getting on the boat, and that's not really good for their living condition. All right, so now we've moved a little bit further down the hull. we kind of come to the midship section of the ship, and you'll find this arrangement of load lines. And these are really important for the ship for stability. Each mark tells you, based on the salinity or the operating environment of the vessel, what's the safe loading condition for the vessel. So I'm gonna first focus on the top tree here, the one that's painted. Every load line has to be permanently stamped or welded in place, so you can never ever remove it, and it has to be painted contrasting colors to the hull. And this is a perfect example where you have a red hull and white paint. And they really have three choices: white, black, or yellow. So if it's a black hull, they can choose white or yellow. If it's a red hull, they can choose white most of the time. And then if it's a blue vessel, they can choose pretty much any color. But that's something you'll learn with your experience. On each tree, there's two parts of the load line tree. First is the plimsoll mark. It's that little circle in the back with the line across the middle. It's a really fancy term for saying that this is their summer draft mark. And just like you can imagine, summer is talking about a time of year. So that line, if you move over to the other side, I'll talk about it in a minute, it will line up with a specific line on the other part of the tree. But that plimsoll mark is a requirement for every vessel to have that circle with the line through it, to marking where this vessel can safely load herself to during the summer months. Above that circle are a marking telling us what class society issued that load line. In this case, you see the letters N and K. That is indicative of NNK, so it's the Japanese class society. You might see AB for ABS, you might see BV for Bureau Veritas, and there's a whole bunch of other ones that you might see out there, but those are some of the big hitters. Now, if you move over a little bit to the left, I was talking about that other part of the load line tree, and each marking on that tree is indicative of a time of season and a salinity of water. So starting at the top, you'd expect water to be a little bit less dense when it's fresh and warm. So that's why we have a TF, tropical fresh load line. You go down, the next mark is the freshwater line. And very, very close to it is the tropical one. So again, that one's gonna be warm, salty water. It's a little less dense than your regular summer water load line. You go down, you'll see the S. S is for the summer load line, and this is the one I was talking about. When you look at the plimsoll line, they should line up perfectly with each other. So plimsoll line, summer line, they should be in a line. Below that is your winter, and that one's where your cold, salty, dense water, that's the most dense water, so it's the bottom line. If you come up to this and the water line, and you're at the pier and the water line is just above the load line, you're not at a problem yet, but you want to have a conversation with the captain. Load lines only apply when the vessel is outside of the boundary line. So when they're here at the pier and they're doing fluctuations for loading, they may temporarily submerge their load line mark for the area you're at, but you have to have the talk with the captain to figure out their plan, or if they've done the calculations, to know that they'll be fine out at sea, or what their plan is to correct their current load line situation. There are a couple other load lines. You'll learn them with your training. There's load lines that are associated with timber. There's load lines associated with really, really high latitude locations, but that's something that you'll learn with experience. Now this one's a chem boat, so it also has this very interesting, unique part to it. If you notice, there's 3 load lines stamped onto the vessel, welded onto the vessel, but only one of them is painted. This is okay. For tank vessels and chem vessels, you see this quite often. It's basically for tax purposes. When they paint the line that they're using currently, it's denoting their deadweight tonnage for tax purposes. When they travel around the world, they have additional load line certificates that they will activate and change the painting scheme to match the tax scheme that they're trying to optimize. So if they're traveling the Suez Canal, they might paint down to the next load line down. If they're doing the Panama Canal, they might keep with the top line. Every company has their own little secret, but that's why you see multiple load lines. And the only thing you have to verify is when you're looking at the documents later, is to make sure they have the correct load line out and ready for presentation. So that's more on that later in your training. So the last mark is is what we call the deck line. And if you go from your plimsoll straight up the hull of the ship, you're gonna find this little white line, welded or stamped, parallel to the deck line, almost at the top of the vessel or somewhere in between. That deck line is telling you the uppermost watertight compartment deck. And when we're on board later, if we are going through a space that's below that deck line, we should be expecting watertight enclosures. And you'll be learning more about that later during your training. Now, while I have you here, I'm going to transition and I'm going to talk a little bit about means of access to the vessel. And this is a perfect case study for what we would say is not a suitable condition. They have some things right, but some things could be improved. What we want is a safe means of access from the pier to the main deck level of the vessel. They want to have railings at a suitable height, and they want to have good traction, non-skid, or cutouts on the deck, or little ribs on the catwalk to help you walk up. And they want to have a cargo net under it, so if something were to fall, gear, some type of gear, or heaven forbid a person, they would have a way to get caught and not fall down and risk a serious injury. But this is the part that they don't really have a good setup for. That incline, I would not consider an ideal situation. In the regulations, they have clearly delineated limits to what type of elevation you can have on that access gangway. And this one's very steep. It's well beyond those limits. So it might be a good opportunity now to go in, take a look at those regs, and kind of see where the limits are. And then when you're here at the pier, you can be taking those into account and risking doing a risk assessment for your own personal safety before you decide to embark this vessel.